Okay, that's working.
Yeah.
And then we're going to open it to people here. Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting very soon. We're just giving a few minutes for everyone to join the meeting, and then we'll get started with this evening's presentation. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes to let people join our meeting. Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagerdician of the Armenian Studies program. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's presentation. This is the final presentation in the Armenian Studies program fall lecture series. We've had actually 10 events over the past 3 months, and this evening will be the final one for the fall, and then we'll have a new series beginning in the spring. All of our events this semester were held on Zoom. And for any of you that missed any of our presentations, you can go to our YouTube page, the Armenian Studies YouTube page, and I'll put a link for that in just a moment to look at any of our past events. This evening, our special speaker is Dr. Ohannes Kılıçdağı. He is the 17th Kazan Visiting Professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State. And I would like to thank him for his contribution to the program by teaching a course, which he's been teaching all semester. And he has also given previously 2 public lectures. The first was on the question of the conscription of the Armenians into the Ottoman army following the Ottoman Revolution in 1908. And then the last lecture was on a very interesting topic of how the Turkish government sees its Armenian citizens and the question of the status of Armenians following the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923. Dr. Kılıçdağı completed his doctorate in 2014 with a dissertation called Socio-Political Reflections and Expectations of the Ottoman Armenians After the 1908 Revolution, Between Hope and Despair. And he's had quite a bit of experience teaching. He's been teaching both in Istanbul at Bilgi University. He's also taught at the Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In 2017 to 2019, he taught at Harvard University. And earlier this spring, actually, in 2020, he was a visiting professor, the Nikit and Eleanor Orjanyan visiting professor at Columbia University. And of course, this semester, he has been teaching as the Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies. His special interests are the history of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey and the intercommunal relations in ethno-religious societies, citizenship, and minorities. Tonight, it's a really fascinating lecture. I know personally for me, it's an area that I find very interesting. It's the question of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul under the light of the last crisis of the patriarchal election. And what Dr. Kılıçdağı will be talking about is once again the question of status. So what he'll start with the discussion of what was the status of the Armenian Patriarchate in the modern Turkish Republic, and then he's going to talk about the recent patriarchal elections, and it's really a fascinating story. It's almost a melodrama of actions and what people have been involved with, and I very much look forward to this because this is very much tied into also the status of the Armenian community, because the Patriarchate is the most important institution still existing within the community. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Ohannes Kılıçdağı. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Dermagadican, for this kind introduction and having me a visiting professor for this semester. It was a joy for me, although online and from remote. I also learned much from my students here. And before starting, also let me thank all your participants for joining us for this lecture. As you said, today I'm gonna try to focus on the status and situation of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, and with a special focus on this, let's say, last crisis between roughly 2008 and 2019, basically an electoral crisis. Just let me try first share my screen for my PowerPoint. Yeah, okay. But before focusing on this last crisis, electoral crisis, we should have a historical perspective, although brief one, without which it wouldn't be possible to understand even this last crisis. So let me try to draw a quick historical background of the problem, or let's say the status of Patriarchate. Beginning from the Ottoman times, as you know, in the logic of Ottoman millet system, the Armenian Patriarchate was recognized as the main, even sole, up to a certain point, say, representative of Armenian community, and had been given some civil and even political duties to perform among the Armenian community. For centuries, let's say, of course, with certain fluctuations, this situation lasted more or less for centuries. But in 1863, by a legal document, which was called Constitution, Sahmanatrutun, by Armenians, by Ottoman Armenians, and regulations, Nizamname, by the Ottoman state, this document limited the power and authority of the Patriarchate and Patriarch by forming some civil bodies and organs which will check and balance the Patriarchate and Patriarch. Okay. However, let me say that this was the first time that such a codification, let's say, was realized in Ottoman millet system. It was not peculiar to the Armenian community. Other non-Muslim communities also had similar, let's say, documents, legal documents, organizing their internal affairs. As I said, this document at a certain limit, in a certain way, limited the power or the authority of Patriarch and Patriarchate. However, it preserved the leading role of Patriarch, as he would supervise civil bodies and, more importantly, continue to deal with the government, the Ottoman government circles, as the main interlocutor of Ottoman Armenians. Okay. Of course, many events happened of the time, so I'm gonna skip all these events to save the time. But during the despotic regime of Abdülhamit II, 1863 constitution, by the term used Armenians, became practically dysfunctional anyway, and Patriarch again became the sole interlocutor of the state in organizing affairs related to Armenians. After the 1908 revolution, maybe I should say this before, Abdülhamit II he also suspended the Ottoman constitution and established his own despotic rule for, let's say, almost 3 decades, okay? In 1908, a revolution, so-called, let's say, revolution, because there are other debates about it, but leaving aside all this, in 1908, a revolution happened that restored the Ottoman constitution and parliament. And meanwhile, the Armenian constitution of 1863 was also revitalized after July 1908. So Armenian political parties, which had been working underground during the Hamidian reign, became legal and public and emerged as a competitor for communal leadership, besides Armenian Patriarchate. Therefore, after 1908, after the revolution, the Armenian Patriarchate was not alone in representation of the Armenian community, as there were Armenian politicians and MPs in the parliament talking to state circles related to different matters, various matters of Armenian community. So the authority of Armenian clergy within the community was also challenged by these Armenian political circles, Armenian political parties. However, none of these means that the Patriarchate and Patriarch became unimportant after the 1908 revolution. The Patriarch in capital and the prelacies in provinces were still important interlocutors of Turkish politicians and bureaucrats. So we cannot say that after the 1908 revolution, Patriarch and Patriarchate became futile, became unimportant, became meaningless. They, up to a certain point, preserved their position. For example, just for the sake of an example, the Minister of War himself visited the Patriarch to discuss the conscription of Armenians into the Ottoman army. Okay, even in such a matter, which seems purely political, even in such a matter, still Armenian Patriarch and Patriarchate were figures to discuss this issue. Shortly speaking, although its authority was challenged, the Patriarchate preserved its legal position defined by 1863 Constitution, even after the 1908 revolution. Let me forward fast all these years of World War and genocide, which was devastating for Armenian community as well as for Armenian community. But let me again fast forward through this period and come to the Republican time. Okay, as you know, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared as a separate state, I mean legally separate state from the Ottoman Empire, which had officially ended almost 1 year before, when the Turkish National Assembly in Ankara abrogated the dynasty, the Ottoman dynasty. So what was the attitude of this new republic, new nation state vis-a-vis the Armenian Patriarchate? This new republic indeed has rejected to recognize any civil bodies or organs as the representative of Armenians. Here I use the term civil in the meaning of non-religious, okay, just as a note. So all bodies, all organs created by the 1863 Constitution then were just dismissed or eliminated from the scene by the Republic. And the Constitution itself, I mean the 1863 Constitution itself, was not abolished by a legal action, but became null and void in practice. Okay, so the new Turkish Republic, in other words, did not abrogate this 1863 constitution by another law or by another legal action, but practically speaking, left it null and void. Okay, so its attitude toward the patriarchate has been more ambivalent, though. Okay, since the 1863 constitution, as I say, had become practically invalid, there remained no legal document that defines the patriarchate and specifies the rights and responsibilities of patriarch, and also specifying the rules of election, patriarchal election. So the Turkish state did not generate any legal document pertaining to these subjects. I mean, as I said, the rights and status of patriarchate, rights and responsibilities of patriarch, the limits of his authority, the way of his election, etc. All these subjects, which were very critical, left open. Okay, there was nothing legally, there was nothing to stipulate these matters. Okay, in this sense, in legal sense, the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul does not exist. Okay, basically, it doesn't exist as a legal corporate body or institution. There is no such institution, legally speaking, in Turkey just now. Okay, but on the other hand, one may observe that Armenian patriarchs have been accepted de facto representative leader of the Armenian community through the history of the Turkish Republic until today. Okay, Turkish statesmen and bureaucrats, for example, receive patriarchs to discuss communal problems of the Armenians, or receive petitions from him. I mean, petitions about communal problems or various matters. So, as another example of his de facto situation of representativeness, he is invited to participate in official ceremonies and celebrations on certain national days as the representative of the Armenian community, as I said. So, shortly speaking, on the paper, patriarchs are ordinary men, and there is no difference between a patriarch and another Armenian, okay? But in practice, they act as the representative leader of the Armenian community, and they are accepted as such by the state and treated as such by the state. So, in other words, there is a clear discrepancy between the legal status and actual situation of the Armenian Patriarchate. De jure, there is no such institution. De facto, it is the representative of Turkish Armenians still today. Okay. As for the election of patriarchs, if we have a quick look again from 1863 to today, 1863 Constitution stipulated that the General Assembly, Armenian General Assembly, which was elected by popular vote of Ottoman Armenians, would elect the patriarch. Okay, so there would be a General Assembly which had 140 seats allocated to Istanbul Armenians and provincial Armenians. So Armenians in the capital and also in provinces would elect this General Assembly, and later this General Assembly would elect the Patriarch. Very, very basically, very, very roughly, this is the pattern set by 1863 Constitution. Patriarch Zavender Yagyayan fled the country in 1922, in the face of pressures coming from Turkish nationalist government in Ankara. Okay, maybe many of you know that after 1922, this nationalist government in Ankara won, let's say, all the wars. It fought against the Greek army and dominated, let's say, if you like, dominated the political order of the country after 1922. So in the face of pressures coming from this government, this, if you like, new nationalist government in Ankara under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, then, as I said, the Patriarch Zavender Yereyan had to flee the country, okay? But officially, he did not resign from the post of Patriarchate. So until 1927, Bishop Kevork Aslanyan led the Patriarchate as locum tenens, a kind of deputy. And in 1927, Mesrop Naroyan, Archbishop, I think, Mesrop Naroyan, was elected as the new patriarch. And maybe we can say that he was the first elected patriarch in the Republic of Turkey. Although the details of this election are not clear, it seems that the existing General Assembly, I mean, transferred from the Ottoman time, elected him as the patriarch. So Naroyan acted as patriarch until his death in 1944. After his death, the religious council elected again Kevork Aslanyan as locum tenens. Here, let me stop for a quick explanation or short explanation. Normally speaking, whenever a need for election, patriarchal election occurs, basically two initial steps are supposed to be taken: to elect the locum tenens, to observe the routine affairs of patriarchate as well as the electoral process, and to form an initiator committee which would be responsible again for the realization of election and for technical details, let's say, like preparing the list of electors, etc. So electing a locum tenens and forming an initiator committee should be the two initial steps, normally speaking, in the election of patriarch. So in 1944, after Naroyan's death, the religious council elected Kevork Aslanyan as locum tenens. However, quickly, as a disagreement, a dispute occurred between Kevork Aslanyan and some other clerics. And after this dispute, a crisis erupted. And this crisis lasted between roughly speaking, 1944 to the end of 1950. But I'm not gonna focus on the details of this crisis, as it is a long and complicated issue. It's a separate issue. But those of you who want to learn more about it may apply Talin Suciyan's book entitled The Armenians in Modern Turkey. Okay, but basic reason of this, let's say, delay of 6 years was the disagreement among Armenian clerics, and because they were divided into two camps, this election took so long, let's say, to carry out. But at the end, this election happened or carried out in December 1950. As Suciyan says, finally, Turkish government allowed the election of General Assembly, this is critical, for a single task, which was to elect the Patriarch. So on November 25, for almost 14,000 Armenians voted and elected 99 members of the General Assembly. 1 week later, this popular vote, the General Assembly convened and elected Archbishop Karakin Khachaturian as the Patriarch. The following elections in 20th century in Republican time were in 1961, 1990, and 1998. And all occurred due to the death of existing patriarch of the time. And from 1950 to 1998, all elections were carried out in accordance with ordinances or regulations promulgated by the cabinet, by the Turkish cabinet of the time. What is critical is that, again, this is an important point, every and each time they absolutely and carefully underlined that these ordinances were peculiar to that particular election and would not generate, by their words, would not generate any legal effect in the future. Similarly, they clearly emphasized that every committee or body formed for the election by Armenians would be dismissed immediately once the election was finished. So, technically speaking, in the elections of 1950, 1961, 1990, and in 1998, the General Assembly, defined by the 1863 Constitution, was elected for a single task and for a single day, okay? So if I reformulate the sensitivities of Turkish government, I may say that they have been cautious not to create any permanent piece of legal codification that binds themselves in the future. Thus, they, on purpose, they create a legal vacuum and use this legal vacuum to treat the Patriarchate and Armenians arbitrarily, depending on the conditions of the day, which we will also observe in this last crisis between 2008 and 2019. So additionally, they have been also very cautious not to open the way for any permanent civil committee or council of Armenians, which may remind the organization created by the 1863 Constitution and act as the representative of Armenians. Let me repeat once more. They have been also very cautious not to create any or open the way for the creation of a permanent civil organ representing the Armenian community, okay, which reminds the character of 1863 Constitution. However, let me give a detail here, which is, I think, telling. In 1990, the government of the time tried to eliminate popular vote in the election of Patriarch. And according to the first ordinance at that time, sent by the government, the Patriarch would be elected by representatives sent by neighborhood committees without any popular mass vote, okay? Just a single representative from each neighborhood would be sent to the Patriarchate, and that body, let's say, that body would again elect the Patriarch, okay? However, upon objections filed by the members of the Armenian community, the government in 1990, the Turkish government, practically backed off from its initial decision and returned to the regulations of 1961. In fact, regulations of 1961 were followed also in 1990 and 1998 elections, almost verbatim, except some changes in the age limit to be elected. Now let me show you as a list the conditions of being patriarchal candidate according to this 1961 governmental ordinance. I'm not going to repeat one by one, as you may read on the screen, but just let me take your attention to the last, let's say, condition, quote unquote, which reads as having the confidence of the Turkish government. In other words, in order to be a candidate in this patriarchal election, all candidates should or were supposed to have this confidence of the Turkish government. And again, the problem is that how can one define that confidence? I mean, having the confidence of a certain government cannot be a legal prerequisite. And in other words, it cannot be an objective criterion for any candidacy. So I think this is also this can also be read again as a sign of arbitrariness in these affairs, in these electoral affairs of the Armenian government. Now, let me turn to this last crisis of Armenian patriarchal elections. But let me warn you, this is a long and complicated process. There are many events, many meetings, many decisions, many lawsuits, etc. I mean, myself, even I lived through all these events, but sometimes even I'm confused who did what in this the crisis of a decade and which event followed which event. So I'm going to try to be as simple as possible, as brief as possible, hopefully to make you follow these events. So, and I prepared some basic chronology, maybe through which you can follow more easily. Everything started with the last elected Patriarch Mesrop Mutafyan's illness, which was first diagnosed in 2006. And this illness, this disease, a kind of neurological disease, left him unfortunately in coma within a couple of years, okay? And he remained in this vegetative state for more than 10 years. Normally, as I said, as I explained before, whenever a need for patriarchal election occurs, clergy elects a locum who is supposed to lead the election and govern the routine affairs of the patriarchate until new patriarch is elected. However, in this case, as you see on the screen, Archbishop Aram Ateşyan did not wait for the election of locum tenens and for the formation of initiator committee, but made an application by himself, by his initiative, to the Governorate of Istanbul to elect, quote unquote, a co-patriarch on, and the date of this application, as you see, December 3, 2009. Why is called co-patriarch? According to their logic, since Mesrop Mutafyan was still technically alive, and since all patriarchs are elected for life, then a new patriarch couldn't be elected, but a co-patriarch, atoragits in Armenian, and eş-patrik in Turkish. So according to their logic, only a co-patriarch might have been elected, okay? So they made an application to the government via the Governorate of Istanbul to elect a co-patriarch, okay? After this application, initiator committee was elected on December 16, 2009. And on January 14, 2010, this committee, initiator committee, made a separate application to the Ministry of Interior via, again, Istanbul Governorate for the election of, this time, just patriarch, not co-patriarch, but patriarch, okay? So at this point, then, the government received two distinct applications from Armenian community for the election of co-patriarch or patriarch, okay? And, you know, again, as a note, let me mention that this conflict or this internal disagreement among Armenians is always used as a pretext by the Turkish government to stall the processes or to avoid taking actions or taking some certain steps. The governor of Istanbul did not respond to any of these two applications for a long time, 4 months, let's say. Eventually, as you see again on the screen, eventually on June 29, 2010, the governorate of Istanbul sent a letter to the Patriarchate in which they said that neither a patriarch nor a co-patriarch could be elected as Patriarch Mutafyan was still alive. Instead, they said that the religious council may have elect a general deputy of patriarch. So this was totally a new title, okay, made up by the government or the governorate of Istanbul. But Ateşyan, the Archbishop Ateşyan, declared that he would obey this instruction immediately even. As a matter of fact, the religious council of the Armenian Patriarchate elected Ateşyan as, quote unquote, the general deputy of patriarch on June 31, 2010, meaning that only 2 days after the letter of governorate arrived the Patriarchate, then without having any discussion, deliberation, negotiation with other members of the Armenian community, in a haste, let's say, they elected Aram Ateşyan as this general deputy, so-called, let's say, general deputy of the Patriarch. And both ordinary people and the initiator committee objected this governmental decision and election of general deputy, as they claimed that there had been no such title in history of Armenian Church, and it was also contrary to the articles of 1863 Constitution, as well as democracy itself. Okay, so a civil initiative among Armenian community launched a campaign where they collected almost 6,000 signatures demanding the immediate implementation of the patriarchal election. They submitted these signatures both to the Ministry of Interior and Ateşyan himself. Nevertheless, despite all reactions, protests from the community, Ateşyan continued to hold the title of General Deputy and the chair of Patriarchy. After this, despite this unease, discomfort among community members, for almost 5.5 years, no major development took place in this issue, in this matter, until 4 members of the Armenian community filed a lawsuit on November 2015 for the appointment of a conservator, for a legal conservator for Mesrop Mutafyan, as he was not in a situation to make his own decisions and, of course, to run the patriarchy. And the court, the Turkish court, accepted this demand and appointed Mutafyan's mother as his legal conservator on March 10, 2016. And this became another official confirmation of his physiological and legal situation. And on June 22, 2016, a few dozens of Armenians organized a protest, a rally in front of the Patriarchate building in Istanbul, and where they read a public release demanding the election. And their slogan was, "We want to elect our patriarch." So this lawsuit or decision by the court and these protests brought about some acceleration in the process. And on October 26, 2016, General Assembly of Clerics under the chairmanship of Bishop Saak Mashalyan decided to retire Mutafyan and initiate the electoral process. Meanwhile, they decided that Ateşyan would keep his title of General Deputy until the permission for the election arrives from the government. Supposedly, as a necessity of this meeting, Ateşyan should have made another application to the Governorate of Istanbul for election. But it was later understood that he had made no proper application to initiate process after this meeting. So, a break point in this story came on February 13, 2017, when the chairman of Religious Council, Bishop Saak Mashalyan, resigned with a bitter letter blaming Aram Ateşyan. He said that because of Aram Ateşyan's resistance, electoral procedure couldn't be initiated. Although all should have lasted few weeks, no application had made for almost 4 months after Mutafyan's retirement, or the decision of Mutafyan's retirement. He added, Mashalyan added, it was clear that as long as Ateşyan remained as deputy, the election wouldn't be realized as Ateşyan was stalling people. This resignation indeed and this bitter letter brought about a stir in Armenian community. And 3 days later, the representatives of the neighborhood committees and pious foundations of Armenian community settled a meeting in the church of Kumkapı, I mean the main church of Armenian Patriarchate, to negotiate the current situation. That evening, a crowd of almost, let's say, 200 people gathered there, including myself. However, before that meeting, communal meeting, a group of 13 so-called, let's say, notables, including Ateşyan and Mashalyan, came together at the Patriarchate. And it is strange that no one in the meeting accepted that he himself organized the meeting. All participants of this limited meeting, let's say, including Bedros Şirinoğlu, said that he was called into meeting by someone else. Let me here to stop for a moment to explain who is Bedros Şirinoğlu with a few sentences. He has been the president of Surpırgiç Hospital in Istanbul, Armenian hospital in Istanbul. I'm not sure, for then maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years, I'm not sure. And during this period, he has been acted as self-declared leader of the Armenian community and having meetings with President Erdogan or whatever interior ministry, etc. And the Armenian community listen state's messages from his mouth. Okay, so usually he is the figure who relays the messages or wishes of Turkish state to the Armenian community. Okay, maybe we can discuss this more maybe in question and answer section. So, as I said, besides this communal meeting, this limited group of 13 people had another meeting in the Patriarchate. And as a result of, let's say, this side meeting, they prepared and signed a protocol which stated that a locum would be elected next day, whereas Aram Ateşyan would keep his position of general deputy until the election. So this protocol was contradictory in itself, as after the election of locum, there would be no need to keep the deputy, okay? Because there would be two figures for the same task, okay? And indeed, when this group, this limited group, joined the larger meeting, where the representatives of foundations and lay people were waiting and tried to impose this protocol on them, a tension occurred at that site, okay? Even some scuffle took place. So at the end, basically speaking, that day, that meeting produced nothing but a dead-bone protocol. But after all these skirmishes and fight and tension, Catholicos Karakin II called Aram Ateşyan, Saak Mashalyan, and Karakin Bekçiyan for a meeting in Etchmiadzin. And Karakin Bekçiyan was the leader of Armenian community of Germany, and he was also one of the natural candidates in patriarchal elections. Okay, so these three and the Catholicos of Karakin II met in Etchmiadzin on February 24 and 25, 2017, and agreed on a new protocol which stated that the election of locum would be completed until March 15, 2017, after which the authority of General Deputy, Ateşyan's authority, would end. The election of the locum would be followed by the formation of initiator committee in accordance with customs. Okay, so Ateşyan himself agreed with all these in the presence of Catholicos. Okay. On March 15, 2017, the General Assembly of Clerics really gathered and elected Karakin Bekçiyan as locum tenens. He received 23 votes, whereas Ateşyan took 11 votes. However, a very strange, let's say, occurring happened. Minutes after the finalization of election, Ateşyan presented a letter coming from the Governorate of Istanbul, bearing the date of the same day and with the inscription head letter urgent. Okay, this letter of Governorate stated that the deputy of Patriarch Ateşyan was still in charge and there was no legal base to initiate patriarchal election. So a very telling detail is that this letter was faxed to the Patriarchate at 1:48 p.m., whereas the election meeting started at 3 p.m. I know it seems like a detective story, but this is important because it means that Ateşyan knew that there was such a letter before he entered the election meeting, okay? Election meeting for locum tenens. In fact, Bedros Şirinoğlu openly declared that if Ateşyan had been elected as locum, this letter of Istanbul Governorate would have never showed up. So Bekçiyan called Ateşyan to obey the protocol of Echmiadzin and resign from the title of General Deputy. But Ateşyan replied that the conditions for his resignation were not, quote unquote, ripe. Okay, so in the beginning of April, Şirinoğlu also made a public declaration in which he urged Bekçiyan to resign, okay, from the post of locum tenens. Despite this letter coming from the governor of Istanbul, another important step forward was taken and a new initiator committee was elected on July 4, 2017. Okay, 17 members were elected by the votes of foundations, neighborhood committees, and 5 members were chosen by the locum himself. And meanwhile, the General Assembly of Clerics withdrew Ateşyan's signing authority of signature, and gave it to Bekçiyan on July 26, 2017. Okay. On August 9, 2017, the initiator committee sent a letter to the governor of Istanbul and proposed December 10 as the date of election of delegates and December 13 as the date of election of Patriarch. However, Şirinoğlu said that the Turkish state, did not approve the initiator committee and it should have been abolished. I mean, the initiator committee should have been abolished. Later, he also added that the state did not recognize Bekçiyan as locum tenens, and his name, Bekçiyan's name, was crossed out by the Turkish state due to a past interview in 2016 in which Bekçiyan had criticized Turkish state and Erdogan. So the governor of Istanbul of the time accepted Ateşyan, Maşalyan, and Şirinoğlu in a meeting and the head of initiator committee, Sarkis Külegeç, on October 24, 2017. Bekçiyan did not participate in that meeting because at that time he was in Germany. So 2 days after this meeting, 4 members of the initiator committee resigned without any certain explanation. So a meeting happened in the governorate of Istanbul, and a few days later after this meeting, 4 members of the initiator committee resigned without any explanation. So at the end of December 2017, Ateşyan made a public release in Yerevan in which he said that every actor should have obeyed the state, the Turkish state, which had recognized only him as the deputy, and therefore Bekçiyan should have withdrawn. On February 5, 2018, the governor of Istanbul forwarded a letter from Interior Ministry to the Patriarchate. And the ministry claimed that health problems couldn't be a reason to make Mutafyan's Patriarchate null and void. Therefore, as the post was not empty, a locum couldn't be elected. Accordingly, the letter contended that Ateşyan was still in the charge of deputy. And in accordance, in obedience to this letter coming from ministry, on February 9, the religious council had a meeting and decided to obey this letter of governorate, and they declared that Ateşyan was still deputy. So they said that, in a way, did not recognize the authority of Bekçiyan as locum tenens. So nothing left for Bekçiyan but to resign and leave Istanbul for Germany, which he did on February 13, 2018, I'm sorry. So in his last statement, Bekçiyan said that this was a long and planned campaign to sabotage the election. Okay. So meanwhile, protests from within the Armenian community against Ateşyan persisted. For example, some flyers satirizing him were posted on the walls in the neighborhoods of Istanbul, where Armenian population is relatively high. Okay, slightly more than 1 year later, Bekçiyan left the country. Patriarch Mesrop Mutafyan passed away on March 8, 2019. So that the post of Patriarch, the office of Patriarch, became officially, quote unquote, empty. Okay, and after his death, a mourning period of 40 days was declared, during which no official step was taken for the election. Indeed, you know, in my opinion, this was an unnecessary decision, and it caused another delay of 40 days. Okay, and you know, although this is speculation, I think that governmental circles used also this time to think about what they should do in this electoral process. Okay, on April 29, 2019, the Religious Council convened and decided by vote 5-3 that there was no need to elect the locum tenens, and electoral process would be managed by Aram Ateşyan as General Deputy of Patriarch. This was against the traditions of Armenian Church as well as the 1863 Constitution, as I explained. This decision brought about unease among the members of the Armenian community. So many people criticized this decision. So even after the death of Mesrop Mutafyan's death, Ateşyan tried to maintain his title and position. However, maybe I can tell unexpected at this point, an unexpected move came from the government. On May 13, 2019, the Minister of Interior, Süleyman Soylu, who is still posting that, he's holding that post, visited the Armenian Patriarchate, and he stated that it would be right and appropriate to proceed the electoral process by a locum tenens. He added that President Erdogan also agreed with this. So rather than with a general deputy, he advised, quote unquote, advised to elect the locum tenens in accordance with the customs of Armenian Church and 1863 Constitution. Meanwhile, I want to open an important parenthesis. Meanwhile, when in the beginning the government rejected the demand of election, some Armenians had opened a lawsuit in 2010. After certain legal phases, that case ended up in the Constitutional Court. On May 22, 2019, Constitutional Court of Turkey made an important decision and declared that the freedom of religion of Armenian citizens had been violated by the government. Okay, although, I mean, since Patriarch Mutafyan had already passed away at this time, an electoral process had already initiated, this decision of Constitutional Court did not bring about any practical conclusion for that moment. However, that decision, I think, is critical because for the first time in the Republican history, a Supreme Court, a Supreme Turkish Court, made a decision which openly recognizes the civil rights of Armenians and advises the protection of these civil rights, okay? So I couldn't pass without mentioning this court decision, although, again, it didn't generate any practical difference in this process. I think this decision is important and deserves to be handled in detail somewhere else, sometime else, okay? So if we continue with the story, on June 18, 2019, the religious council then convened again, and this time decided to elect the locum tenens. However, this time they excluded Karakin Bekçiyan from the election of locum tenens on the pretext that only those clerics who were working in Turkey could participate in the election of locum tenens. Consequently, only Aram Ateşyan and Sahak Mashalyan were allowed to participate in the election of locum tenens, and at the end of which Mashalyan was elected on June 4 and became the locum tenens. Subsequently, a new initiator committee was elected on June 17, 2019 to organize and supervise the electoral process. Okay, so this new elected initiator committee started to have meetings with state officials for the preparation of a new governmental ordinance specifying the rules of coming election. This ordinance finally arrived the Patriarchate on September 23, 2019, and indeed caused another uproar, okay, another chaos, as it added another condition of candidacy which did not appear on the previous ordinances of 1961, 1990, 1998. It stipulated this new condition, prerequisite, stipulated that only those bishops who were, quote unquote, peculiar to the Armenian Patriarchate could participate in the election. Okay? They justified this requirement by referring to the corresponding article of 1863 Constitution. Let me show you that article directly from the Constitution itself. As you may read, these are the paragraphs stipulating the condition in 1863 Constitution, stipulating the conditions of candidacy. And as you read there, this part on the left is Armenian, part on the right is Ottoman Turkish in Armenian script. And indeed, in Turkey, the Turkish government in 2019 exactly took the same expression from this 1863 constitution to define this new condition, prerequisite of being candidate, which says, eskadim in Turkish, eskadim patrikliğe mahsus olan episkoposların sınıfından. So when we translate it into English, it means those bishops who were peculiar to the Armenian Patriarchate, okay? And they interpreted this phrase as referring to clerics who were ordained priests by the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, first time their ordinance, okay? Consequently, only 3 clerics will be eligible according to this condition, this new condition for candidacy, namely Karakin Bekçiyan, Aram Ateşyan, and Saad Mashalyan. And all other potential candidates, to count some, Hajak Barsamyan, Viken Aykazyan, Sebuh Çulcan, and some others, were automatically excluded from the process, okay? After this moment, after this new condition, the Armenian community was divided into 2 camps, okay? One party defended that on an objection demanding reconsideration of the ordinance should be filed and submitted to the government, as the current one violated the rights of Armenian people as well as potential candidates other than those 3. The other camp claimed that such an objection to the government was not a good idea, as it may have postponed the election for an unknown time, for many, many years, let's say. So locum tenens Saak Mashalyan supported the second camp, saying that he was not willing to act as locum tenens for years, for an unspecified time, although he accepted that the governmental ordinance was wrong in this sense. In fact, the initiator committee was also divided within itself, as several of its members resigned from their posts. Since the committee couldn't make a final decision, they decided to consult with the neighborhood committees of Armenians. They organized a meeting where all representatives of neighborhoods came together on October 3, 2019. And although this meeting was not transparent enough, the president of Initiator Committee, Hosrov Köroğlu, and locum tenens Saak Mashalyan announced that participators of this meeting decided not to file an objection to the government and proceed with the given regulations by the government. So a considerable segment of the Armenian community objected this decision, and Karakin Bekçiyan declared that he wouldn't be one of the candidates, so he refrained from his right in the election, both to protest this decision and show his solidarity with other candidates whose rights were openly violated. A group of Armenians again opened a lawsuit against the governmental ordinance. However, all these did not generate any change, and the election was carried out on December 8, 2019, and as a result of which Saak Mashalyan was elected as the 85th Patriarch of Istanbul. And the number of votes is such: Mashalyan took 9,008 votes, whereas Ateşyan received 3,529 votes. But also there is a third group, which I can define as the protesters. And these protesters used on purpose blank votes or invalid votes as an indicator of, as I said, protest. And the number of these votes also is not negligible. It was 1,121 votes for protesting. So consequently, let me finish with 2 sentences. Consequently, we saw once more in this election that how the absence of a permanent official legal document defining the patriarchate and organizing the election create arbitrariness, and how this arbitrariness erodes the Armenian community. In the lack of clear rules and regulations, the members of the Armenian community conflict with each other and start to fight, okay? And this internal tension every time also erodes the community. And this last election was a clear example of that erosion within the community. Of course, the members of Armenian community are actors of a stage, but set by the Turkish state. We cannot blame only Turkish state for this crisis. I mean, as I tried to explain, some members of Armenian community were also responsible and to be blamed, if you like, in this crisis. But eventually, this is a structure, this is a stage set by Turkish state through decades. This is not something new. This is not peculiar to recent or existing government. This is a stage and structure prepared by Turkish government. And as I said, Armenians are just actors in a stage, on a stage set by the Turkish government. Let me stop here. I think I talked too much, too long today. Sorry for that, but it was a complicated process to relay. I hope I did not confuse our listeners. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Kılıçdağı, for that very interesting, very detailed look at the process by which patriarchs are elected. For the audience, I would invite you, if you have a question for Dr. Kılıçdağı, you can use the question and answer function, which is found at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in a question. And once we start getting some questions, I will be sharing those questions with Professor Kılıçdağı so that we can have a little bit of a discussion, maybe some questions that you have. One question that comes to my mind is, what is the real power of the patriarch today? In other words, what is his real power within the community?
Actually, you know, it's just a matter of prestige. Just because of the same reason, since there was no permanent legal rules and regulations defining the limits of authority, the authority and influence of patriarch and patriarchate depends on the influence and prestige he has, let's say, among the members of the community. So any institution, any foundation, any pious foundation in Turkish vakıf may not obey the patriarchate and patriarch, and in the face of this, they wouldn't receive any sanction, or they wouldn't face any sanction. It's just, if you like, let me use this word, it's all gentleman's agreement, a kind of gentleman's agreement. If they wish, they obey. If they do not wish, they don't obey the patriarchate and the directions coming from the patriarchate.
That's because each property, each church property has its own foundation, and only does the patriarch control at least the patriarchal headquarters as far as a foundation?
You know, as I said, there is no such foundation as patriarchate. And each foundation, and usually these foundations include schools, churches, and cemeteries within their body. And each of these foundations, legally speaking, is a separate and independent entity. And they have no legal link, okay, with the patriarchate. So they are completely, at least on the paper, legally, they are completely free in their decisions. And as I said, there is no foundation as patriarchate, okay? Patriarchate does not exist. You know, even, let me tell you something as a detail, the bills, utility bills of patriarchate building are written to the name of that certain patriarch, whoever resides in that particular building, because there is no such corporate entity to which you can send them even a bill, a utility bill. That's the situation. That's the legal situation.
In reality, then, does he have any funding, access to funding, or it only comes from, where would donations?
Exactly, donations and, you know, fees taken from weddings, funerals, baptisms, etc. Those kind of fees collected from Armenian people constitute the income, and donations constitute the income of Armenian Patriarchate. So since there is no such a legal corporate body, it is not possible for them to hold a property, a private property, and collect rent income from that property. So okay, this is existential, if you like, this is an existential problem for the Armenian Patriarchy.
Okay, we have a question. I think you had presented some rules about qualifications for the Patriarchate. So the question is, what is the date of the rules that you listed and presented?
1961.
1961. Okay,
1961, and these same ordinance, or if same regulations, whatever, were also used in 1990, in 1998 elections. I mean, in this last election in 2019, largely it was the same ordinance, same regulations, but of course with a vital, let's say, supplement, with a vital addition, which I mentioned among the prerequisites of being candidate. Other than that, it's the same, more or less same regulations, ordinances since 1961.
Except, and as a follow-up question to that, originally the Archbishops Bekcan, Barsamian, and children were eligible. Were they first eligible?
Yeah, according to 1961 ordinance, all of these names were eligible for candidacy. But this last one eliminated all others except the three, Bekçiyan, Maşalyan, and Ateşyan.
Okay. Another question. During recent times, what steps, if any, have been made to give the Patriarchate legal status or to endow the Patriarchate with legal status? Has there been any efforts?
This is an issue. This is an issue continuously mentioned by patriarchs. I mean, even the current one, Maşalyan, and up before him, Mutafyan, etc. Again and again, they relate this demand to the governmental circles. But until this date, no tangible, no solid result came out. And still, if you like, all these demands put on deaf ears on the governmental side, and they haven't generate any legal document giving even, rather than defining, there is no such thing, giving a legal corporate status to the Armenian Patriarchate. It's still pending, if you like.
What about the other groups, such as Greek Orthodox Patriarchate? Does that exist legally?
No, I think same problem, more or less same problem, is also valid for other non-Muslim communities. And indeed, this is minority policy, if you like, of Turkish Republic, Turkish government, and not to create any permanent legal document and legal body, I think is deliberate action, deliberate policy of Turkish Republic. And that's why I do not hope in near future that they will generate such a legal document for Armenians or for others.
I mean, has there been any thought from the Turkish circles, government circles, about simply, I mean, it's already doesn't exist, but formalizing that non-existence? In other words, formally saying that there is no status. I mean, it's kind of saying.
I mean, practically, this has been already the situation. Okay, yeah. And you know what? In 1961, in this regulations ordinance, they said that this, not word by word, but roughly, they said that this ordinance was prepared until a permanent bylaw or regulation is produced for these elections. And it was in 1961. And still, we are waiting for such a piece of legal document defining status of patriarchate and the rules of elections, rules and regulations of elections. So in 1961, they said until they prepare a permanent document, but today is 2020, still that document is supposed to come.
So a follow-up question again. So you just talked about the government has been approached, but they don't listen. But is it possible that there could be a judicial action as an alternative means to this?
Yeah, and you know, as I mentioned in my talk, several judicial steps were taken, several lawsuits were opened, But the first problem with this lawsuit is that it took too long to have a result from these lawsuits. Even still, some lawsuits opened against ordinances and administrative decisions government are still pending, even though the patriarchal elections was realized almost 1 year before. Okay, but as I said, this doesn't mean that it is completely futile to go to follow legal way, because as I mentioned, in the example of decision by constitutional court, it may produce important results if you are willing to use that decision, okay, or that kind of decisions. So, of course, it's a detailed issue, that decision by constitutional courts, but some interpretations of that decision even opened a potential way of liberation, quote unquote, liberation of Armenian communities and other non-Muslim communities, because that decision advises the observation of contemporary human rights, okay, in treatment of Armenians and others. So it is an important decision, but Armenian community and other communities should be willing to use that decision in their, let's say, struggle for their civil rights.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate it very much. We want to thank you again for 3 very interesting perspectives on the Armenian community in Istanbul, in Turkey, and about your insight into that. And it's been very interesting. Once again, if you would like to go back to any of these presentations, you can go back to the Armenian Studies YouTube channel to be able to watch that. So thank you all again, and good evening, and thank you, and we'll see you next year at our next events coming in the spring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.